Hi guys, a lot of people have been asking me what they should play in Arena for TBC Classic. I figured I would make a quick unedited video going over my tier list. This list considers all classes in their 2.4.3 balance, which will most likely be the balance patch for TBC Classic. At the top of the list, we have the S tier specs, and these are specs that, in my opinion, are extremely overpowered in TBC, and you'll see these basically in every team. The first spec is the SL Warlock. This is a spec that comprises the Demonology tree and the Affliction tree. You basically get Soul Link, which makes you extremely tanky, and you get the healing from the Affliction tree. The two of those combined together make you nearly invincible, and you do extreme spread damage. You don't really take any damage. It's a fairly easy spec to play. You'll see a lot of success as a spec with very minimal effort. It'll be very easy to find teams. Be very popular too. Next up is Resto Druid. Resto Druid is by far the best healer in TBC. You have several different specs you can play. You can play Dream State for increased mana regen. You can play Swiftman Feral Charge for good healing and support to your team. Or you can just play Tree Form, which is full Resto for extremely high healing. Most teams in TBC will be playing with the Resto Druid. It's a very easy healer to learn, very forgiving. Definitely, if you're a healer and you're looking for a class to play, Druid is probably the best choice. Next up is the A tier specs, which in my opinion are like the meta specs. Like you're going to see these in most games. They're definitely near being overpowered if they're not already overpowered. The first up is Arms Warrior. Arms Warrior has a 50% physical MS in TBC, which is extremely strong. Putting that on someone makes them nearly impossible to heal. Arms is very tanky naturally. Putting on a shield and defensive stance makes you very, very hard to kill. Do pretty good damage. You have Mace Stun in TBC, which is a proc stun, which is obviously very strong. Procking a stun at the right point gives you a free win in TBC, which is very broken. Overall, a fairly easy class to play too. The hardest part about playing Arms Warrior is just going to be setting up all your macros and keybinds. Once those are all set up, it plays a lot of it for you pretty much. Definitely probably the easier of all the melee specs to play and do well on. Next up is the Subtlety Rogue. In 2.4.3, Hemo Subtlety with swords, fist weapons, or maces is generally the spec all rogues play. It's very strong in 2.4.3. You have a lot of mobility, a lot of CC, not a ton of damage, but your goal playing the spec is to just set up the match so that your other partner can do damage, and most of the time your healer will also be doing damage because the best comp to play is RMP, and most rogues will just be playing RMP. Definitely a very powerful spec, but not one you should play if you like doing big damage, but more if you like controlling the match. Next up is Frost Mage. Frost Mage is very close to being S tier. I would put it in S tier, but it has probably one of the higher skill caps in TBC, so it's going to be harder to play. If you're a new player, I wouldn't really recommend picking it as your first caster. You just have a lot to do, but having a lot to do is very strong in TBC because in pretty much every situation you can be contributing to either CCing, damaging, just very strong overall. Next up is the Disc Priest. The Disc Priest is probably one of the worst direct healers in the game, but has probably some of the strongest offensive capabilities of any of the healers. You have offensive purge, you have pretty good damage, you have shields which synergize extremely well with rogues and mages. You have probably one of the top comps in the game, which is RMP, which is pretty much all you'll play as Disc Priest. I wouldn't recommend playing Disc Priest unless you're a very offensive player, because if you try to play Disc Priest defensively, you're just gonna fall behind all the other healers. Next up is the B tier specs. These specs are specs that are pretty good. You have kind of a couple comps each of them can play generally to do well in. The first up is Enhancement Shaman. Enhancement Shaman in TBC does a lot of damage in 2.4.3, but it has the downside of having very low mobility and also having mana issues. Your defensive shamanistic rage is also the way you get mana back. So you have to choose a lot of the times between using it to regen mana or using it as a defensive to keep yourself alive, which is very hard to do. Enhance has a couple comps that are going to be decent. You probably play Turbo, Enhance, Warlock. Another big issue with Enhance though is you have a very high miss chance when you're attacking as Enhance. So playing with specs that can stun the target, like Warrior with Mace Stun or Rogue with, Chief Shot, Kidney Shot, it might be the choice for Enhance. Next up is Ele Shaman. Ele Shaman in TBC can do a lot of damage, but a lot of your damage is also RNG based on Lightning Overload, which has a chance to shoot additional attacks when you attack. In Arena, you usually want to be as reliable as possible to reliably win games. So the fact that you're kind of tied to a RNG mechanic can be rough. But I guess on the flip side, you can also win games that you wouldn't normally win just by one-shotting people. Ele is also one of the tankier specs, but you don't really have any active defensives, so that can be rough to deal with. And also, you have very, very poor mana. So a lot of the times, if you don't win pretty quickly, you're going to find yourself trying to run to drink while your team slowly loses, which is not good. Next up is Feral Druid. Feral Druid in TBC is pretty strong, but usually most people say it's weak. I think it definitely has one of the higher skill caps in the entire game. You have the ability to swap to a healing weapon and heal. You have the ability to go into bear form and be extremely tanky. You have very high mobility. You have pretty decent damage. I think you can definitely be very successful as a Feral Druid, but it's going to take a ton of effort. Next up, we have the 300 specs. I kind of group all 300 specs together since generally you'll play them all the same way. Most hunters in TBC end up playing double healer hunter, just mainly due to the fact that they can abuse Viper Sting to drain mana and survive. Hunters really don't have a lot of mobility in TBC, which is a pretty big weakness for them. BM can do a lot of damage, but your pet can die very quickly, which is hard to deal with. Marksman has silencing shot, but basically no defensives, and it's very hard to move your character around. Survival has a lot more defensives and CC than the other two specs, so I think that's the spec that will most likely be able to play other comps, more of like a support class. Overall, a hunter is pretty decent, but can be very frustrating to play in TBC, and you only have a few comps you can play. Next up is Demo Warlock with Felguard. This is a pretty decent spec. It's a little bit harder. A lot of the spec is based around your pet, which you have to control. So if you're not used to controlling your pet, micromanaging it a lot, it can be hard. This spec is just generally kind of a downgrade from SL in my opinion, so my recommendation would just be to play SL. Next up is Boomkin. Boomkin is very underrated in my opinion in TBC. I think it has everything that's needed to be a good DPS class in TBC. It has good single target damage, good spread damage, good support, good CC, and it's fairly tanky. I think going into TBC Classic, this will be a spec that will catch on and become more popular as time goes on, once people kind of realize what's going on. I think you can play both Wizard Cleaves with this spec and also melee caster comps with this spec. Next up is Assassination Rogue, or generally referred to as Mutilate Rogue in TBC. Mutilate is a little bit higher damage than the other Rogue specs, but it has a positional requirement and less mobility. Therefore, it becomes extremely hard to do the damage that you kind of are hoping for. In my opinion, it's not necessarily a bad spec, but it is kind of a downgrade to Subtlety, because most of the time you don't really need to do damage as a rogue to win the game. You just need to control the match until your partners can win for you. Next up is Shadow Priest. Shadow Priest, the opinion on it is definitely probably one of the most varied of all of the specs in TBC. Some people think it's very strong, some people think it's very weak. In my opinion, Shadow Priest is definitely viable in certain compositions. Having no defensives and no mobilities as a cloth class is very hard to deal with. You're going to get trained and you're going to die a lot. Your specs that you play with need to be able to peel for you. Like if you play with like a Frost Mage that can peel for you or a Rogue that can peel for you, those are probably going to be the best comps. There's just a lot of very bad comps for Shadow Priest that if you play them, you're just going to be at a significant disadvantage. You're going to die constantly. Another problem is your fear requires you to be in melee range of who you're fearing. So a lot of the times you have to choose between CCing the team or staying at a good distance so that you don't die. On the flip side, silence is a very powerful ability in TBC because it cannot be trinketed. So a lot of the times as Shadow Priest, you can, if set up properly, you'll win games without the enemy healer even trinketing because they can't, because you will just silence them and kill someone before the silence is up. Next up is the C tier specs. These specs are viable in very specific situations, but generally not very good. The first up is Resto Shaman. Resto Shaman is a very strong healer and has a decent support for his team, especially with Bloodlust and Offensive Purge. The problem with Resto Shaman is almost all of your healing comes from direct heal casts and Earth Shield. Earth Shield can be purged off instantly, entire stack can be purged off with one purge, which makes it very hard. And the fact that you have to hard cast all of your other heals against counter spells, spell locks, it's it's very frustrating to play and definitely not good for a new healer because if you don't juke very well, you're just going to constantly be locked out and you're not going to be able to heal anyone. And your totems really don't heal for much in TBC. You'll have a few specific comps that you can play with this, and you'll definitely see a lot of them very high rated, but in general, you're just going to see Resto Druids take their places in most compositions. Next up is Combat Rogue. Combat Rogue in 2.4.3 is not as good as it was in the earlier patches in TBC. It has lower mobility than Subtlety and kind of fulfills the same role. It has Adrenaline Rush plus Mace Stun, but neither of those really make up for the loss of mobility and control that Subtlety gives. This spec might be good outside of Arena for PvP. I would definitely not recommend playing Arena as this spec. I would just recommend playing Subtlety instead. Next up is the Arcane Mage. There's two specs people play. People either play full Arcane or Palm Pyro. Both specs are decent in Arena. The main issue is you sacrifice a lot of the defensive capabilities that Frost has, so you're just gonna get run down most of the time playing these specs, and there's really not much reason to play them. Some players don't like playing Frost, so they'll just try to make this work, and it'll definitely work in very specific situations, but in general, I would just recommend playing Frost instead. Next up is the D tier specs. These specs are just not very good, and you might see a couple players in TBC Classic succeeding with them and getting potentially Gladiator, but in most cases, you will not see these specs high rated in Arena. The first spec is Holy Paladin. Holy Paladin in TBC is very bad. It's by far the worst healer. It has very little support capabilities. It has very little offensive capabilities compared to the other healers. It has a lot of range issues. You generally don't want to be on top of the enemy team as a healer, and if you want to hodge people or judge them, you have to be on top of them, which is very bad. You have decent healing capabilities, but all of your heals are hard cast, and while you have talents and auras to reduce the chance of you being spell locked or increase the chance that you can resist spell locks, you don't really want to base your entire healing around RNG resist. So you end up trying to juke a lot, and then your team just dies because you're not healing at all. You might see some success in 2s early on in the expansion, Season 1, and you might see some success in 5s playing Holy Paladin with 4 DPS. But beyond that, you probably won't see much success in 3s. Next up is Fire Mage. Fire Mage is fairly bad in TBC. It has decent damage, but you have to hard cast a lot, and you have basically no defensives, which is extremely rough in TBC. Once people realize you're fire, every game you'll be getting trained, and you just won't be able to do much. You'll end up spending most of your mana trying to survive, and once you're you basically lose the game. I would not recommend playing fire. I would recommend playing frost instead. Next up is Ret Paladin. Ret Paladin is probably one of the worst DPS in all of TBC. Ret Paladin has very little defensives, very little mobility, and very little damage outside of cooldowns and RNG. Almost all of your damage is cooldown and RNG reliant in TBC, which is not good. You will lose most of your games without having done much at all. Most people consider Ret in TBC a complete meme spec, and the only comp you'll ever have any real success with is in 2s. You can play Resto Shaman is like considered a pretty good 2s team. In 3s, you can play Arms Warrior, Resto Shaman and see some success, but you probably will never get to the Gladiator level in 3s playing that. Maybe a couple people will, but beyond that, you will not see much Ret Paladin in TBC. Next up is Holy Priest. Holy Priest is not very useful in Arena, mainly just because you lose out on pain suppression that Disc has, you lose out on power infusion, which Disc has, to trade a little bit more healing and a little bit more casted damage, but neither of those are really that important for Priest, and it's just basically a direct downgrade from Disc, so you'll just really never see it that much. Next up is the E tier. These are specs that you're just never going to really see in TBC at all. They're really bad, and you'll just never want to play with them, have them on your team. The first up is the Fury Warrior. Fury Warrior is just basically completely useless in TBC because it requires you to have high uptime on the target, and the thing with Warrior is you're not going to have high uptime, but when you do hit them, you need to hit them very hard. That's why Arms is very good. The second you connect on someone's arms, you're doing a lot of damage. You're putting the MS effect up on them. As Fury, you're going to connect on people. You're not really going to do any damage. You're not going to have the MS effect up on them. It's just very bad. I would not recommend playing Fury in Arena in TBC. And last, we have the Destruction Warlock. The Destruction Warlock is probably one of the highest damage casters in the entire game, but all of your abilities are hard casted, you have no mobility, and you have very few defensives. So the second the enemy team realizes you're playing Destruction, they're just going to run you down, and you're never going to get a cast off, you're never going to do damage. You might find some success as Destro playing with a Frost Mage, but basically any other spec is better than this, and you might find some success in fives, but even then, it's going to be very rough to play, and I wouldn't recommend it outside of the extremely experienced Destro players. Like if you're new to the game, it's not the spec for you. And that does it for the TBC Arena class rankings. Thanks for watching.